My name is Ayodele Oni. I'm a partner in Bloomfield. It's a law firm. I'm the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Practice Group. We do a lot of transactional work. Someone is buying or selling a gas asset, an oil block. We advise the regulator and the government on transactional regulatory issues, consent. For example, the NAOC Ajip Oando deal, we advised on issues relating to the grant of consent and approval, whether the deal was qualified for ministerial consent, the approval of the regulator, and all of that. We also advise on policy issues. Myself and some of the members of the team worked with the UK NIA, the next year team, on the National Integrated Electricity Policy and Strategic Implementation Plan. We also do a lot of drafting documents, negotiating contracts for clients. And then apart from that, I always say to people that if you an advisor in an area of the law, you also want to invest. I'm also the largest investor in an LPG company, Avgas, together with my wife. We are investors in Avgas. We own 80%, maybe close to 90% of the equity in that business, and we have two plants at the moment, a major LPG plant and a smaller skid, and we're working on our third and fourth as I speak. So primarily that's what I do. I also teach. I teach energy law and policy. Yeah, that's much I do. I'm also an author. I've written 5 books on oil, gas, natural gas market, electricity, energy security. I've written quite a number, and I've written over 200 articles relating to gas and power and energy, generally speaking. So that's what I do, and that's what I do here in Bloomfield and outside of Bloomfield.
So talking about natural gas, being that you are an investor, as a private owner and also an energy lawyer, Nigeria is often described as a gas country, yet we continue to experience significant shortages in gas for power stations. In your opinion, what are the legal and regulatory challenges contributing to this?
It's historical, to be honest. Imagine that until we had the PIA, Petroleum Industry Act, the old law, the Petroleum Act of around 1968, 1969, said nothing, maybe apart from defining natural gas, said almost nothing about natural gas. So there was no law, there was no legal basis supporting, particularly a statutory one, supporting natural gas. With time, there were pieces of guidelines, regulations here and there around natural gas, like the dump gas policy, domestic gas supply regulations, and all of those came on stream. So for a long time, there wasn't any law. And if gas projects have long lead times, and it takes a while, and you need substantial investments, even more than liquid hydrocarbons, more than crude oil. So if over time you didn't have it until, say, 2021, or bits and pieces from like 2008, 2007, you would have challenges. And also looking at it from a policy, because I always say that the law is a vehicle for implementing policies. Policies are there, but policies by themselves cannot generally be enforced in court. What you then do is to issue a set of regulations or pass laws which you want to use to implement the policy you already have. So I'm always like, when you want to do reforms, when you want to do anything in any sector, particularly in the energy sector, you need to first have a policy, which will be the overarching thing, and then you make laws on the back of those policies. So the government policy at that time was to force gas producers to even sell gas less than the cost of production. Imagine that you are a car manufacturer, for example, or you even manufacture something as little as glass cups, and it costs you ₦1 to produce one, and government tells you to sell for 50 kobo. And you're not talking about ₦1 to produce, then there's that margin for you to make a profit. They're not even saying sell for your cost price. No, sell less than your cost of production. You forget even about profit. No one's going to do that kind of business. So over time, the fiscals were wrong. Fiscals being FISCAL. The financials didn't make sense. The commercial arrangement didn't make sense. That's one. And on the back of poor commercial arrangements, no one's going to invest in infrastructure. Even when people started things like the NLNG, what those projects and the GTLs, gas to liquids, some of the IOCs, what decided to do? They were export projects because there was no incentive. Apart from the fact that maybe there wasn't sufficient demand in country, the major buyer was what used to be NEPA. Never expect power at all. I mean, it's National Electric Power Authority, right?
Yeah.
And because they were a government entity, government determined the price, they bought the gas. And it was less than the cost of production. So from commercial arrangement going wrong, no one invested in infrastructure historically. And remember, to build infrastructure is expensive and it's time consuming. And then policy was wrong. There was no legal foundation to encourage or to incentivize investment in gas. So recently, in the last 10 years, a lot is now being done. But it's coming a little too late, right? Beyond internal infrastructure, domestic infrastructure, we need to have international infrastructure, like the infrastructure, gas to Angola, gas to Morocco, pipelines, all of those. When we couldn't even deal with locals, it was difficult to then do that. The only thing that seemed to make a bit of sense is the West African gas pipeline, right? That was something that was done. And it wasn't only us, a number of countries, I think 3-4 other West African countries, right? So that's the foundation. The foundation was faulty. From a legal, from a regulatory, from a commercial standpoint. So no one was going to invest. So that's why we still have the problem we have around gas now.
Right, so you talked about pipeline, and I quickly want to ship this in. The OB3 pipeline was supposed to be commissioned, or so that it completed last month. Till now, we've not heard anything in that regards. I think in June, the state-owned oil company stated that they will make this available last month. So what is your view on this?
Generally speaking, the challenge we've had with gas infrastructure in Nigeria recently has been financing. Everyone's thinking about going green, dealing with emissions and all of that. And until very recently, when you had the COVID, it was difficult to get financing for gas pipelines and all of that. And I know a few projects that I've advised on that had similar challenges until now, very recently, that people now consider gas, international financiers sort of consider gas green because of the challenge everyone had with COVID, and everyone had to move back to gas from saying we are going green, EVs, electric vehicles and all of that. People move back. So that slowed down many projects. Why? I can't speak specifically to the facts of OBN, but I know the OBN projects, generally speaking, and the faces. But I think that the reason will not be far-fetched. Issues around difficulty raising financing, the back and forth around raising financing, and even how to structure in some cases can be. And usually when you have projects such as that, there usually will be delays. You almost cannot. I'll give you an example of Dangote refinery. The number of times they've said, they've moved the commissioning or the start date. They've had to do that a few times. And that's a very serious businessman right there, right? Not government. Speak much less of when it has to do with government and successive government and changes. And when government personnel changes, people don't pay the same attention. If a previous government has started a project, the next government may not necessarily pay the same level of attention. So these are the things I would attribute, without being too specific, because I do not know the exact facts or reasons why that delay is happening. But I guess those may be some of the reasons.
All right, so let's look at the issues surrounding gas production, gathering and processing in the country. So how does this, if you look at gas flaring, look at the wastage in that sector, I think I did an article sometime this year, and the gas we flared is enough to power half of the demand of the country. So how does this impact the reliability of gas supply to power stations?
Okay, so interesting question. If you look at gas, you've got different gas elements. You've got propane, you got butane. Propane and butane are the cooking gas, right?
Yeah.
In colder regions, it's largely propane. In regions such as Nigeria, it's largely butane. You would have a mix of both. People would argue it should be at least 70% butane, 30% propane in Nigeria for it to last and all of that. And also because I am in the LPG space. So you'd find out that all of these thrive on infrastructure. If you have issues with your infrastructure, and we've got a few new infrastructure over time, particularly when the time of the Nigerian gas master plan came to the fore. So it's not so much around inability or poor technology and all of that. It's about starting late. It's about issues around production in the first place. Now, so if you don't have sufficient production of gas in itself, then processing, gathering, all of those too will be impacted, right? If you don't even have enough being produced. Now, speaking of gas flaring, I always say that it could be tough being a Nigerian at times, but it's not all doom and gloom true. For example, since about 2020, government has been doing what is known as the gas flare commercialization program.
Yes.
Such that, because if you look at the PIA, you'd find out that the government has the right, I think through the Upstream Commission, to take gas destined for flaring at the flare stack. So they can take that gas and that's what government is now doing, taking that gas, having conversations with people they can give permits to access flare sites so that they can use what would ordinarily have been flared for useful projects, for LPG, for CNG, for all sorts of projects that can move the country forward. Because like people say, we're a gas province with some oil. So the issues and the challenges aren't even around, because aren't around gathering and all of that. It's insufficient production, the challenges with production, insufficient investment, then some issues around venting and flaring in particular. So if those have been historically our challenges, but with what government is doing now, if government does not only talk but walk the talk and ensures that these things go through, and the IOCs in particular can also work with the successful bidders for these flare sites, and interestingly, we're addressing a few of them. You're supposed to sign a connection agreement with the owners of the asset, and you're supposed to sign a milestone development agreement with the Upstream Commission, and also a GSA with the Upstream Commission, because ultimately the Upstream Commission owns that flare gas, so to speak, and can sell to you. So that's being done. Now, speaking around gathering and production of LPG, all of those, a lot is being done. I know a number of gas processing plants. In some cases, what you do is to extract gas liquids, and the liquid aspect of gas are those propane and butane that are used for cooking gas. So if you don't have sufficient investment for local use, and it's good that the PIA also talks about a domestic gas delivery obligation, so that every gas producer has an obligation to reserve those are some of things being done, reserve a particular quantity of gas for use in the domestic market. So if those are well implemented and government does what they ought to do, the Upstream Commission enforces, everyone works together, and the commercial arrangement also does make sense, because of course, as well your domestic gas DG supply delivery obligation, you also have willing buyer, willing seller. Anything outside of that, you have the gas aggregator, who sort of holds everybody's hands, issues a gas purchase order, works with the parties on ensuring that they can sign a gas sale and aggregation agreement. So the framework is in place, it's just that it took a while. So I'm not sure we have so much challenges around. If the commercial arrangement works, all of the infrastructure, all of the technology will not be a problem. And if this gas flare commercial program of the federal government works, I think in a few years we will be a gas hub in the world.
All right, so I will take it from where you talked about CNG. So last year when this administration came on, they talked about trying to move from diesel, petrol because of the cost, to CNG-powered mobility, say buses and cars. So if you look at the policies that have been put in place since then, why does it look like the initiative appears to be not improving? I don't want to say in all noise than action. Why is it that we're looking at it like it's lagging, it's not moving the way it should? And also, what do you see as the legal or institutional gaps, that is, stopping the implementation?
Okay, so I think that first, I think what government is doing is a fuel subsidy substitution policy. So that they substitute, instead of giving you subsidy, they're substituting it with cheaper fuel. So instead of me giving you subsidy, no, I'll give you cheaper fuel, which is gas, right? And we did try something in one of our gas plants, and I think there was a 28 to about 30 something percent, 32% savings when we switched from using PMS, I think, to using LPG to run one of our generators. And there was that saving. We looked at it over a period of time. So I think it was a monthly saving of 28 to 32%. Right. So it's what government is trying to do. Rather than give you subsidy, we want to substitute. Now, why has it not worked? I think a few issues. At times, there is a stop and start when you change government personnel. That's one thing. Secondly, I think that the government is fighting too many battles at the same time. There's so much policy change. There are so many policy changes that it at times it's difficult to be able to follow through each and every one of them if things are happening about the same time. That's another thing. Another thing you may want to consider is the fact that when you have policies around energy, magic doesn't necessarily happen. It takes a while. Because first, they're supposed to first convert. The world doesn't make cars that are CNG cars, generally speaking. It's internal combustion engine using PMS or using diesel, or people are now doing EVs. So if you want to do CNG, that means you need to buy a kit and do the change. First question is, how many people can afford it? At some point, government was saying they were going to do some free. But how many can the government actually do? It's gaining ground, but not as fast as one expects. So I think it's one, government is chasing too many things at the same time. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good or a bad thing. It then means that implementation, which is where our problem usually is, needs to be very strong. There needs to be, there are offices that are supposed to be implementing all of this. Government set up offices under the vice president, gas. This is a decade of gas, right? Yeah. The stuff around gas penetration and all of that. There are offices under the vice president to ensure that we make progress. But at times it may also be the case of not having round pegs in round holes, right? To have the right people to help ensure implementation. So I think it's from having many things done at the same time, maybe not having sufficient personnel to see those things through. Also the fiscals, the financials, how many people can really afford it? There may be trust. People are like, will this CNG actually be available? Will government see this policy through? Or would it be a situation where I convert my car from using PMS to CNG and I don't have access to CNG? Because you would ask yourself, how many CNG stations do you even see? Right? In Lagos, I can't remember ever coming across any, right, on the island. I haven't been to the mainland a lot of times in the last few months. So I'm not sure I've seen any CNG. So maybe even also financing. Because is it easy that I go to a bank and say I want to start a CNG project? Unless I bring sufficient security, they will ask for my house, my mom's house, they ask you for all sorts, or unless there's some form of backstop from government. So if all of these are not in place, it will struggle. It will take time. Energy has a long lead time, and it will take time for you to get to your destination. All hands need to be on deck. Now, like I said, it also goes to trust. Whether people really believe that government is doing enough or is going to see through that policy. So I think these concerns are also the basis for the slow growth of CNG, in my own view.
All right, so I will stick with implementation. Where we're talk about implementation as being one of the major problems that we have in the country. Now, let's look at the value chain in gas. So within the Nigerian sector, the Nigerian gas sector, where do you think bottlenecks typically occur? And how could this be addressed from your own experience?
Okay, well, in my view, it's everywhere. It's from upstream to midstream to people damaging pipelines, whether they know it's gas or crude. It's across the entire value chain. Even from financing, I did say that I've had clients who've wanted to buy gas blocks and just couldn't raise financing. So if you have brilliant ideas and you can't raise financing, you try your best, structure, all of that, you just can't find it, then there's a problem. I think one of the things that has made China powerful, even in the US, their government provides a lot of support, particularly when their citizens even go abroad to do transactions. They follow them, they see them through. There's cheap credit, right, for international transactions. So even upstream in that production, then at times people are not even patient and do not understand that the dynamics for gas are different from crude. People think I invest today and I start making money shortly after. It's a longer play for gas. My understanding of that sector is that it's a longer play for gas. So there is a mismatch of the financing and maybe the technical and the business people. And historically, many of them don't even want to do gas because they think you find people who find gas and they're like, gosh, it's better to even find water than to find gas. That's historical too, and that's also what you will see. Many people would rather crude and they start making money a few weeks, a few months after, rather than gas, and they have to wait. Also because there isn't even enough infrastructure, backbone infrastructure by government to support such projects. A lot is going on, AKK, Ben, all of that going on, but it's a bit late in the day, and government is now quite broke. I mean, if it was when the country was much more prosperous, I think a lot of gas projects, a lot of backbone infrastructure should have been put in place. That's upstream. Financing, lack of understanding by some investors. If those who understand say, I don't want to wait forever, I want to enjoy now, I don't want the situation where I'm building for my children's children alone, I will also want to enjoy it, so I'd rather go for crude. But that's that. Also, at times, people sitting on acreage, historically, where government gives you an asset, you just sit on it and you're not doing anything and you're looking for a way to sell it. The PRA has done quite a bit around that to get things going. So for upstream, midstream, downstream, pricing has been a challenge, and historically also demand was quite weak. Pricing has been a challenge such that you had a regulated arrangement for pricing. If you have a regulated arrangement for pricing, everyone wants to do export rather than sell in the domestic market. So that's been a challenge. The legal regime was always a challenge because it seemed to, and I've had friends in that sector who've complained about pricing and who's complained about the problems caused by sort of over-regulation, particularly around the fiscals. That's been a challenge. Poor infrastructure, midstream infrastructure has been a challenge. I mean, there's a lot being done now, pipeline, with a number of private companies saying they're extending pipelines to Aqua-Atlantic, to parts of Lekki and all of that. And an interesting project that is happening in the Lagos Free Zone, where you have the Optimera project, where interestingly we are advising on, where you have First Hydrocarbons Nigeria, Falcon, and the Western Gas subsidiary. So a lot is happening. But because we left it late for several years, we're still feeling that impact because guys have gone ahead, And I do not think historically governments, and I'm not speaking to these governments, successive governments have done enough, have given enough support to that sector. So that's the result we find today. Results of neglect, results of not doing enough, results of even corruption when we want to do deals by asking them for whatever it is you ask them for. You've heard business people like Dangote complain about wanting to do deals, and they make it difficult because it's more about what's in it for them than what's in it for the country. So those have meant that development hasn't happened at the pace it should happen, right? So that's it. If you plants now, midstream, downstream, where people do dewing to be able to extract liquid gas and maybe to be able to do more around LPG, We're a country that has huge gas reserves, so you shouldn't be importing LPG. Every now and then, and you may have seen it, particularly in the last 2, 3, 4 years, you'd hear that there's almost no LPG anywhere and prices skyrocket. And they tell you it's logistics, something happened bringing it in, there was a delay bringing it in from wherever else it's been brought in from. We should be able to refine sufficient or process sufficient gas for stuff like CNG, for LPG, for all we need in country. Those issues that have kept us down.
All right, so let's look at transparency. Some months back in the year, Ghana released a report that they will be going for 3 weeks without light, without power, because the supply of gas from Nigeria told them they are doing maintenance now. However, a call through to Ghana shows that their dealer or their supplier is basically NGAS. But if you are to go through your system now, you find little to no information about NGAS. How does this impact the country if I, as a journalist, cannot even get data on what NGAS is doing? How do we report? How do we know what the country is really doing, supplying, in terms of supply, export, and all?
Okay, so that's always been a challenge, transparency, and that's why we have laws, regulations around you being able to ask for information, right? Whether in practice, and that goes to implementation, whether in practice that works, whether that's what we've seen, or whether things have failed on the altar of corruption and opaqueness, that's a different conversation. So if we don't have enough information, it leads to chaos. And we're in a sector, in the energy sector, the sector thrives on information. Where there is lack of information, where there are rumors, where there's uncertainty, it impacts pricing. Once you hear there's likely to be war or crisis in a part of the world that is energy rich and that exports a lot of energy, you find out that prices go up. So if we don't get the sort of information we need, it generally impacts adversely the sector. Because for you to even have good regulations, you require data. For you to be able to make sound investment decisions, you require data. So if that data isn't available or isn't reliable, then it makes doing business even difficult. It means that you have fewer people coming to do business, because without data, you can't plot or do your analysis. You can't determine what your financing is. You can't prepare your financial model. You just be groping in the dark. So I think it impacts financing, it impacts reporting, it impacts even checks and balances. Because if you don't know, you can't check what you don't know. You can't report what you don't know. So I think that the opaque nature of some of what we do in the energy sector is more of a problem than many of us think, even those who are responsible for shrouding things in secrecy. It does more harm to them, because whatever impacts the country adversely ultimately impacts the citizenry, whether or not you are wealthy. You have uncles, aunties, relatives that will be directly impacted, and you will ultimately feel the pain. I think the challenges are broad.
All right, so I would like to take us back to flaring gas, especially during a period where petrol is skyrocketing and gas has been a favorable alternative, not just as alternative, but also a source of revenue for the country. Do you think that the current penalty for IOCs, NOCs flaring gas is enough, or do you think it's one of the things propelling them to want to flare, because they feel the pricing is just there? It's not.
Yeah, historically it's been cheaper to flare gas than for you to invest in gas infrastructure, unless you want to do export projects. Now, what's made it interesting? A number of things. One of those things, and that's changing the dynamics. One of them is the domestic gas delivery obligation, DGDO, right? And one of the things that does, particularly under the PIA, and it's been historical, you are not given an export permit. You can't export gas. You can't be involved in any gas project. 2, you pay a penalty under your gas. You are forced to enter into gas sale arrangements of some sort, and then you pay a penalty if you don't deliver. Now, those, in addition to your flare penalties, now make it not as attractive to flare as it used to be. Now, what then is the carrot for investment is the gas flare commercialization program, which I referred to previously, because people are then now able to go and take that flare gas. And we are already seeing, because like I mentioned, I've been advising private investors in the gas flare commercialization program, and you'll see that in some cases the IOCs now start pushing back that they actually have plans to utilize the flare gas and not flare like they used to do. You see, so it then means that a lot of these actions being taken with government are bearing fruit. That's why you would see an IOC or even a junior saying, well, I'd like to even set up a special purpose vehicle to to take that flare and use it for something, right? So many of the challenges we see now are as a result of the historical problems around regulatory, legal, policy, commercial framework. But that's changing. But the impact we are seeing is not as substantial as it could have been. Also because the government is broke. In the last few years, it's been that case. Competition with green energy, with renewables, which makes financing more difficult. So I think that, yes, the penalty for flare historically has been poor, but the additional steps being taken with government is making it more attractive to not flare, and is making it more punitive and serious. So most people are beginning to look at projects, how they can use what would ordinarily be flared for useful midstream and downstream projects.
Okay, so 2 questions before we go, in less than 2 minutes each to answer the question. In your opinion, do you think it's okay, or do you think it's more prudent to have the president being the Minister of Petroleum, or we should just give it out to someone who knows the sector very well to handle?
My preference is to have a separate Minister of Petroleum. But to be honest, either works. And I'll tell you why I say either works. If you have 2 ministers of state, one for gas, one for petroleum, I think that it still does the job, because particularly because the main minister can delegate those powers. You know, say for maybe very sensitive ones, it could still work. But because you may want things to happen very quickly, you may want to have an individual whose job is that, apart from being your president, you're also Minister of Petroleum. I'd rather the other. But I think any of the two can work. It depends on the individuals. It depends on whether the president is ceding enough powers to the other 2 ministers. You recall the president also has a special advisor, or we typically have a special advisor, and that special advisor may actually be acting on behalf of the president and just giving the president feedback. So any model works. But I would prefer, if you ask, my own personal preference will be to have a separate individual.
All right, so let's do the scorecard of the Minister for Petroleum for State, that's gas, Mr. Ekweriko. How would you rate his...
In 1 year, I would say it's 6.5, 7. Also, if you look at the presidential orders, I'm sure he would have played a role. I'm sure he's one of those who are pushing for exemption on gas equipment. I've seen him go and commission a number of projects, CNG. Yeah, he seems to be saying the right things and pushing for gas. So maybe a 7 or 7.5, more than even a 6.5, 7, 7.5. Yeah.
All right. So finally, before you go, what key legislative or policy reforms would you recommend to solve Nigeria's long-lasting gas supply issues?
To be honest, I wouldn't, nothing in particular, save that I would implement what we currently have. The challenge with Nigeria isn't the death of good laws or insufficiency of laws. The problem is always implementation. If we have good laws, which we do have, you can tidy up the PIA here and there, but if you don't implement what you currently have, then you have a problem. Now, I still struggle with the pricing arrangement for dumb gas. I'd rather there isn't regulation around pricing, but enforcing that people reserve a particular quantity for domestic use. But I get the sense around pricing, because if you don't have a ceiling, maybe a ceiling, then gas producers will make pricing a reason why the domestic gas delivery obligation won't work. They just make the pricing ridiculous and no one's going to buy, and then it fails and they then export things. So I see the point, but I know a number of owners of assets, owners of companies playing in that sector who are advised, have complained in the past about the commercial arrangement and pricing. So it's understandable. Other than that, I think we're on the right path around the legal regime for gas. It's just whether we do enough around implementation and whether the incentives we have on paper in real life are being implemented. So that's where I will want to lay emphasis, not necessarily new laws or modifying the laws.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Oni. We really appreciate you on the Anytime podcast. Thank you for having us, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. It's been fun discussing class.